What's happening, everybody? And welcome back to the Chaplaincy on the Go podcast. I'm your host, Josh Zorhoff. I am a teaching pastor and a therapist in the West Michigan area. And this podcast is brought to you by the Fearless family of churches. And we're continuing on with a conversation on emotional health, a three-part series on loneliness and anxiety and addiction. And in the last few episodes, we've talked about some of the realities that we face every single day. Loneliness and anxiety are present in our lives, but incidentally, addiction rates are higher than they've ever been in our culture, not only in our specific area in West Michigan, but nationwide. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Part of the problem is our ever increasing culture in terms of instant needs, gratification, and all of the opportunities that we have to escape. Part of it comes from the pandemic and the fact that alcohol sales jumped up by 300% throughout the pandemic, and so did alcohol consumption. And there's a lot of things that we need to pay attention to. And maybe you're seeing this in your life. Maybe you're seeing this in the relationships that you have. Maybe you're seeing this in your family. But people are more and more habitually addicted to substances, to screens, and even to activities or behaviors that aren't necessarily healthy or helpful. And I want to break down just a few pieces of this conversation on addiction. The first is to realize that when we talk about addiction, a lot of us will write it off almost entirely, saying something like, well, I'm not an addict. I don't go to meetings, or I'm not one of those people. I haven't blown up my life or anything like that. And the challenge is, and I can tell you because I've sat with men and women who have gone through seasons of addiction and are working through that. They didn't wake up one day and say, oh, I think I'll train wreck my life today, or I think I'll become an addict today, or I think I'll have a problem today. They didn't wake up saying, you know what, I'm going to be one of those people today. They probably, much like you listening, thought, I'm not one of those people. I can handle this. It's not a problem for me. And it's a slippery slope. 30% of the given population is prone to addictive tendencies, 1 out of 3. But the reality is every human being has the potential to become addicted to something. In fact, some researchers and psychologists suggest that we are all addicted to something. It just so happens that illegal drugs are illegal. And so those are more blatant addictions. And addictions don't start with addictions. They actually start with habits. In fact, as you're following along to this podcast, in the podcast notes, there'll be a little infograph for you to think through, work through on your own. We've broken this down into a distinction between habits and what Celebrate Recovery people, a Christian recovery program, call hang-ups. And then we've finally kind of broken down the third element into addictions. And habits can lead to hang-ups, and hang-ups can lead into full-blown addictions. And so I want to take some time to look at these categories and just talk through them. And as we're talking about it, make a list for yourself, or a mental checklist for yourself of the habits that you have, maybe some of the areas where you could be in a hang-up and potentially on the bubble of an addiction. A habit is a routine activity that can be recreational. It can be relaxing. Sometimes it's just something we do day in and day out because it's just something we've always done. It can be something that we utilize to escape or find relief from, or distraction from the stresses of life. It can be something that isn't necessarily good or necessarily bad, but I do want to say that what habits are not is they are not neutral. Habits shape us and form us. Whether you read through books like Atomic Habits, or you do some of the research on habit stacking, the reality is these activities that we participate in and day out shape and form who we become. Kurt Thompson, who is a psychiatrist, and we've talked about his work a little bit on the podcast before, says that what we desire is ultimately who we become. It shapes who we become. Our desires shape who we become. So our habits and the things that we do to escape or to experience joy or to experience relief or to get away from everything that we're going through or to numb out in some way, if we desire relief in some way, our habits that grant us that relief actually shape how we become. And the way this works, and neuroscience is proving this, is that in these habitual patterns that we have, it carves neural pathways. Perhaps you're familiar with the phrase, the neurons that fire together, wire together, that when we activate a thought by a behavior, it actually carves a neural pathway in our brain. It connects these neurons. The more and more we activate a habit, the more and more we engage in a habit, the deeper and more cemented in that neural pathway becomes, and the easier it is for us to think about it, the more our brain wants to think about it. And then when you couple that with dopamine, a chemical that is released when we have some sort of relief or some sort of activity that grants us euphoria, if you couple that with dopamine, those patterns actually become activities that our brain longs for and our bodies start to crave. And this can be anything from having an alcoholic beverage at the end of the night. It can come from video games. It can come from dieting or stress eating. It can come from watching the news. I have friends that watch the news for 4 to 5 hours every night. I know people who actually get on a plane and buy online services so that they can stream the news while they're flying because they don't want to feel like they're missing anything, because control is really important to them. These habits that we have, that we give our lives over to, can, if we're not careful, lead to a place where we don't just want to do it, but we feel like we need to do it. And I'm just wondering, what are the habits that you have? Have you thought about your habits that way before? It's not bad to have a drink a night. It's not. It's not bad to watch the news. It's not bad to play video games. It's not bad to have a habit. But are you aware of how that habit might be shaping you? And if you fall into this pattern of repeated behavior, it's possible that this habit could turn into a hang-up. Before we move on into the hang-ups, I just want to point out that even as you're driving, you're listening to this podcast on some sort of device, whether that's a smartphone or a tablet or a computer, but most Americans have a smartphone at this point. And research shows that the younger generation, so children and adolescents right now, spend anywhere from 4 to 5 hours immersed in social media and digital technology, specifically on their smartphones. And adults, we're not that far away from it. We're somewhere between 2 to 5 hours. But then we also stack that with 3 hours of television every night, or screen every night, whether it's actually the TV or the news, or we're binge watching Netflix or streaming. What that means is that we're essentially spending the equivalent of a full-time job every week immersed in social media. And that is, in fact, an addiction. Here's another one that's really interesting. If you're drinking coffee today, or you drank coffee at all, caffeine is the only psychoactive drug, a drug that changes the chemistry of the brain, that is not controlled by the FDA. Why is that? Because we are all addicted to caffeine. And if we didn't have our fix, if we didn't have our Starbucks or our Big B or our local coffee in the morning, we would lose our minds. And the Industrial Revolution was literally built on caffeine and sugar. And so our world operates in it and we normalize it, but it's still something that we could be addicted to. It is a hang up for a lot of us. It's something that we have to have. And that's what a hang up is. It's a graduated habit. It's more extreme. It's more frequently engaged. It's more of a compulsion. You feel like you have to do it versus I want to do it. And if it's not done, it can actually create a sense of anxiety, or you can feel really, really bored until it's completed. You should try this. Try not using your cell phone for 5 hours. See how you feel. Maybe you're listening, you're like, the thought of that, like, what if someone calls me? What if someone texts me? What if I miss something? What if I can't get my email? Well, I need my phone for work, or I need my computer for work. So it'd have to be on a Saturday, but then what am I going to do for entertainment? Yeah, we've actually created a hang up in that. And if you think to yourself, man, I probably do this habit too often, then it's probably a hang up. Here's a couple examples. Multiple drinks a night, not just 1 or 2, but 3 or 4 every single night, or more. You've gotten into a habit of like, I start my drink when I start the meal and I end it before I go to bed. And that could be a 3 or 4 hour window. So I might have 5 or 6 beers, or I might have a bottle or 2 of wine, or I might finish off half a bottle of whiskey. Pay attention to that. If you are all night, late night media usage, whether that is in fact looking at the news or scrolling through social media or going on the marketplace or looking at ESPN sports, whatever it is, if you are immersed in that, it could be a hang up. If you are moving from exercise and dieting to intense calorie counting, like you pay close attention to everything that goes in your body and you're writing it down in a journal and you're obsessing over it, it could be a hang up. Be careful there. If you're exercising every single day without giving your body time to rest, you don't take a day off, could be a hang up. And I want to point this out. Even Olympic athletes take time to let their bodies rest. So pay attention to that. Here's one, I think super important. If you engage in sexual activity, even in the context of marriage, but it's something that you have to do instead of something that is either a delight or something that bonds you to your spouse, you might be on a hang up of that. And especially if you find that you're getting little satisfaction from it, or it's not enough, it may be a hang up for you. Incidentally, if you're experimenting sexually with digital technology, whether that's the form of pornography or something like that, or you're coupling a habit with alcohol or anything that is going to basically increase the amount of dopamine while you are engaging in it, you have to be really, really careful. When those neural pathways are connected to dopamine, like for instance, the amount of dopamine that is released in viewing and exercising sexual activity with pornography is profoundly high. There's just significant amounts of it that flood your brain, and your body gets addicted to that. Your brain gets addicted to that. And so you need more and more to get the same kind of feeling. This is why pornography is so destructive. Same thing with alcohol, same thing with illicit drugs. You have to be really, really careful when we introduce more chemicals into our brain while we are performing habits, because that's how hang-ups can actually lead to something more incredibly dangerous, and that's addiction. It's the highest and most extreme form of a hang-up. You no longer feel like you have control over it. It feels like it controls you. I mean, the statement really is, sometimes the man takes a drink, but sometimes the drink takes the man. And that's part of what an addiction is, that all of a sudden it moves from something that you were doing to something that essentially is making you do it. And you spend your time thinking about it. When can I have my next drink? When can I make that next purchase? When can I watch that next show? When can I do this thing? You start planning your life around that very thing that grants you relief, and you can't control it anymore. And if you don't do it, or the thought of not doing it causes negative mental or emotional or even physical symptoms, you've crossed the line and you're probably in what research would say and statistics would say is an addiction. If you have any kind of withdrawal symptom, or you start to experience like intense mental or emotional distress or physical problems, your body's trying to tell you that it's been hooked on something. And here are some examples. You drink till you're drunk or passed out. Drug usage leaves you needing more and more. You feel completely in a panic or out of control when you can't watch the news. You're constantly counting calories. It's starting to show up on your body, either through starvation or body distortion, or you're exhibiting signs of sexually destructive behavior, like you're acting out either through pornography or other outlets that are harmful to you or other people or the relationships around you. And that's not an exhaustive list. It could be shopping. Compulsive buying is at an all-time high. And if you're buying things and having them, I heard this not a few weeks ago. A person was buying things online and having the packages shipped to his workplace, so he didn't have to talk about the purchases with his spouse. And here's what I want to say: anytime you're hiding, it's an indication that you've crossed the line either to a hang up or an addiction, and you already know it. You already know something's not right. And so, where do you find yourself? What are your habits? Are they helpful for you? Are they a distraction for you? Sometimes habits can be constructive, sometimes they're destructive, and sometimes they are completely unproductive. And what are you spending your time in? Because where we spend our time is where we spend our days, and where we spend our days is where we spend our lives, and where we spend our lives is who we become. So our habits shape us in so many ways. Do you have any habits that are a hang up? That if you're honest, you're like, yeah, I probably need to cut that out, or I need to talk to somebody about that. And are you in an addiction? Are you in a place where you can't stop? Here's something that might be helpful, something for you to consider. If you are in a habit that has become a hang up, tell someone you trust and love about it. Ask them to help you. Reach out to a counselor. Talk to a spiritual advisor. Talk to a pastor or a person who is more knowledgeable or trained to handle some of those conversations. It cannot be healed until it's revealed. We can't experience healing until we start talking about it. So share that with somebody this week. And if you're in a serious hang up that's an addiction, you're not going to get out of that on your own. Very few people have the power to get out of that on their own. In fact, in recovery programs, they will tell you you need other people. And it's true. Kurt Thompson, who is a psychiatrist, and again, we've talked about him, says that healing can only take place in the context of a safe confessing community. So whether that is a program, whether that is some sort of recovery group, or it is a group of people that you trust that are coming together where you can share and talk about these things, that's where healing starts. And I just want to encourage you, if you're in that place and you're working through an addiction, or you know someone who is, we want to help. In this podcast, we want to talk about it. In the next couple episodes, we're going to do some interviews with some friends of mine and people that I know that have walked down the road of addiction or addiction recovery, either individually or personally, or maybe they saw that in a family member. And so we're going to engage in this. We're going to talk about it a little bit more because this is a longer conversation for us. And if this podcast was helpful for you in some way, share it with somebody. And if you know someone who is going through something or you're going through something, reach out. We would love to interact with you. You can send us an email at chaplaincy@fearlessfollower.org, or you can go to our website, fearlesschaplaincy.org. Send us a note. We'd love to talk to you, love to give you resources, point you in the direction of good recovery programs, engage in this with you. If you think something like this would be helpful for the business that you work in, or you'd like to have our team come in and talk about mental health or emotions or depression or addiction, we would love to do that as well. And you can reach out to us again at chaplaincy@fearlessfollower.org or check out our website, fearlesschaplaincy.org. As we continue on in this, please know that we want to be available as a resource, and we're going to keep talking about the habits that can turn into hangups, the hangups that can turn into addictions, and how we can actually experience freedom from them. That's all we've got for now. We'll talk to you next time.